Chapter 1. A Child's Beginnings. The Birth of a Dream. London. The year is 1772. The city hums with life, a growing hub of trade and commerce. In the heart of this bustling metropolis, a boy is born. His name is David Ricardo. His story, one that will echo through time, begins not with wealth or fame, but with curiosity, with ambition. David, the third son of Abraham Ricardo, a successful stockbroker, was born into comfort, into privilege. The family lived in the vibrant streets of London, where opportunity and fortune seemed to be just around the corner. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages filled the air, mingling with the calls of merchants and the rustle of newspapers. London was alive. But for young David, there was always something missing. While other children played games, unaware of the world's troubles, David watched, listened, learned. He observed the figures his father worked with, gentlemen who discussed stocks, trade, fortunes made and lost with the rise and fall of markets. His brothers, too, seemed content to follow in their father's footsteps, to work alongside him, to join the business that had brought their family so much success. But David was different. At just 10 years old, he would sit by the window of their grand townhouse, gazing out into the London streets, dreaming. He could see the ships coming in from distant lands, carrying goods from across the seas, sugar, tea, textiles. Wealth was everywhere. But as his young eyes followed those ships, he wondered, how did it all work? Why did some men prosper while others toiled in poverty? Why were some nations rich and others poor? He was only a child, but his questions were far beyond his years. "David," his mother would call, her voice warm but firm. "Come inside, my boy, you've work to do." And so he would turn away from the window, from the world outside, and return to his father's office, to the ledgers and accounts. His father had plans for him, as he did for all his sons. Abraham Ricardo was a man of business, a man who believed in the power of hard work and discipline. His children would inherit his knowledge, his connections, his wealth, if they were worthy of it. And so, David was trained to follow in his father's footsteps, to join the world of stockbroking, of commerce. His education was strict, focused on numbers, on profit and loss. But something about this life didn't quite fit the boy. Even as he learned the trade, as he studied the market trends, a restless energy filled him. He could calculate the value of a stock as well as any grown man, but in his heart the numbers meant little. There was a bigger picture, a larger puzzle that called to him. One evening, after a long day of work, David returned to his spot by the window. The evening sky was turning dark, and the street lamps were flickering to life, casting long shadows on the cobblestone roads. His brothers were inside, talking with their father about the day's business, but David remained silent, lost in thought. And then it hit him, like a spark. What if the real questions weren't about buying and selling? What if they weren't about making a quick profit or choosing the right stocks? What if there was a bigger mystery, an invisible force that made nations rich or poor, that created prosperity or poverty? He thought about the goods flowing through London's ports, about the way wealth moved between hands, between nations. Trade. There had to be something more to it, something beyond what he'd been taught. It wasn't just about price. It was about something deeper, something fundamental. But he was only a child. How could he, young David Ricardo, the son of a stockbroker, possibly understand such things? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and yet the thought stayed with him, haunted him. While others went about their daily lives, concerned with the usual worries, money, status, marriage, David's mind raced with ideas. He became obsessed with understanding the why, with unraveling the mysteries of wealth and trade. His family noticed, of course. His father especially began to worry. "David," Abraham would say, his brow furrowed in concern, "why do you ask such questions? There's money to be made in business. Leave philosophy to the dreamers. Your path is clear, my boy. The stock exchange is where your future lies." But David wasn't satisfied. He couldn't be. As he grew older, he realized his destiny was not to follow his father's footsteps, at least, not in the way everyone expected. By the age of 16, Ricardo had become more involved in his father's business, gaining the trust and respect of the traders. He understood the workings of the market better than most adults. Yet, with every deal, every transaction, that gnawing curiosity returned. How does this fit into the bigger picture? He would steal moments away, reading anything he could find, searching for answers that the stock market couldn't give him. Economics, trade, these words had yet to be fully understood by the world, but David's heart raced every time he encountered them. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. No, for David, it was about understanding the invisible forces that moved the world. Then came the whispers, the murmurs among the traders. "Have you heard of Adam Smith?" Someone would say in passing, not realizing that the young Ricardo had been listening. "They say his book explains it all, the wealth of nations, trade, the way markets work." Ricardo's pulse quickened. Could it be? Could there truly be someone who had found the answers he was searching for? And so, it began. David Ricardo would one day challenge the ideas of even the greatest thinkers, but for now, he was just a boy with questions. He had yet to realize the path ahead of him, the path that would lead him to becoming one of the most influential economic minds the world would ever know. From that window, overlooking the bustling streets of London, his journey began. A journey that would take him far beyond the life of a stockbroker's son, into the world of ideas, of trade, of nations. He was about to change the world, though he didn't yet know it. In those quiet moments, staring out at the ships that came and went, a dream was born, not of wealth, but of knowledge. Chapter 2. Breaking Free. A Young Mind Awakens. David Ricardo was no stranger to hard work. By the time he was a teenager, the family business, his father's pride, was already a significant part of his life. The clinking of coins, the rustle of paper ledgers, the hurried conversations in the office. They became his world. But deep down, something was missing. David watched his father work tirelessly, day after day. Abraham Ricardo, a respected stockbroker, seemed to have everything figured out. The markets, the numbers, the deals, they all danced before his father's eyes, clear as daylight. And David, the obedient son, was expected to follow in those very footsteps. He sat with the ledgers, ran calculations, and memorized figures. He learned fast, faster than most, but with every task, his mind wandered. Why do prices rise and fall? Why does trade shift so suddenly between nations? The questions gnawed at him, whispering in the back of his mind, like shadows lurking behind every transaction. David kept quiet at first, afraid of what his father might say. Yet the more he learned, the more restless he became. The stock market, this world of buying and selling, profit and loss, felt incomplete. There had to be something more, something deeper. It was a sunny afternoon in the heart of London. The chatter of merchants filled the air as traders gathered at the stock exchange, their voices rising and falling with each new deal. Inside the office, David worked alongside his father. The elder Ricardo's eyes were sharp, focused. "David, check the numbers again," his father's voice echoed. "Accuracy is everything in this business." David nodded, his hands moving swiftly over the papers, but his mind was elsewhere. What was it that made some countries rich while others struggled? Why did England thrive while others barely survived? The answers to these questions couldn't be found in ledgers. There had to be a larger, hidden force at play, one that no one else seemed to notice. He was only 17, but his thoughts were racing far beyond his years. The ledgers, the transactions, they weren't enough for him anymore. That evening, as the candles burned low and the day came to a close, David sat quietly by the fire. His father, content with the day's earnings, relaxed in his armchair. "Good work today, David," Abraham said with a satisfied smile. "Soon you'll take over this business, and you'll make it greater than I ever could." But David hesitated. "Father," he began, his voice soft, unsure, "don't you ever wonder why things happen the way they do? I mean beyond the numbers. Why are some countries rich and others poor? Isn't there a bigger truth behind all this?" Abraham looked at his son, surprised. "David, you're asking questions that don't have simple answers. We are stockbrokers, my boy. We focus on what we can control, the numbers. Leave the bigger questions to philosophers." But David couldn't. His heart raced with excitement, with frustration. "But Father," he insisted, "what if those bigger questions matter? What if understanding why can change everything we know about trade, about wealth?" His father's eyes darkened. "David," he said, his voice firm, "this is the path that has been laid out for you. Follow it. You'll be a great stockbroker. There's no need to chase after dreams that will lead you nowhere." Lead you nowhere. Those words echoed in David's mind as he walked the streets of London that night, the cool air brushing against his face. His father had made it clear. His future was set. He would be a stockbroker, just like him. But David's thoughts refused to settle. He felt as if a door had opened in his mind, a door to a world of ideas he had only just begun to understand. Could he ignore it? Could he really spend the rest of his life dealing with numbers when there was so much more to uncover? As he passed by the docks, he watched the ships arrive, carrying goods from distant lands. His mind spun with questions. What drives this trade? What connects one nation's wealth to another's poverty? The spark inside him flared. David realized in that moment he couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't. His curiosity, his desire to understand the deeper truths, these were more powerful than any path his father had set for him. His mind had awakened. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between David and his father grew. Abraham Ricardo couldn't understand why his son seemed so distant, so distracted. David still did his work, but with every ledger he touched, every trade he observed, more questions bubbled up inside him. Why? 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 One afternoon, David found himself standing before a small bookshop, its shelves filled with texts on philosophy, history, and economics. He had heard whispers of a book, one that explained the mysteries of wealth and trade. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. His heart raced as he picked up a copy. Flipping through the pages, his eyes widened. This was it. The key to everything he had been searching for. Adam Smith's words spoke of invisible forces that moved the market, of nations growing rich not through chance, but through patterns, rules, laws. David bought the book without hesitation. That night, he read until the early hours of the morning, his mind devouring every idea, every theory. It was like a veil had been lifted. He could see it now, how nations interacted, how trade wasn't just about prices, but about relationships, about choices that affected the fate of entire economies. The more he read, the more certain David became. He couldn't stay in his father's world, not forever. There was something greater waiting for him. But breaking free wouldn't be easy. His father's expectations weighed heavily on him, and his family's future seemed tied to the business. Yet inside, the spark grew stronger every day. His journey had begun. As David gazed out of his window one last time that night, the streets of London alive with the sounds of the bustling city, he knew he had to follow this path, wherever it would lead. He wasn't just a stockbroker's son anymore. He was David Ricardo, a young mind awakening to the possibilities of the world and the mysteries he was destined to unravel. Chapter 3. Rebellion and Love. The Turning Point. The decision came suddenly, like a bolt of lightning striking the calm skies of David Ricardo's life. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't wanted to defy his family. But love doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't follow rules. And David, a man of reason, of numbers, of calculated decisions, found himself in the midst of a storm he could never have anticipated. Her name was Priscilla Ann Wilkinson. She wasn't like the women David's family had expected him to marry. She wasn't Jewish, she wasn't from a family of wealth and status, but she was everything to him. Her gentle heart, her calm voice, her unwavering belief in her Quaker faith. She filled David's world with a light he had never known. And in her presence, for the first time in his life, he felt free. But love doesn't come without consequences. The Ricardo household had always been strict, steeped in tradition. David's parents had raised him with the expectation that he would marry within their community, within their faith. It was the way things were done. In their eyes, family, faith, and business were the pillars of a good life, and straying from any of these was a betrayal of everything they held dear. When word reached Abraham Ricardo that his son had been seen with a Quaker woman, whispers spread through the family like wildfire. David's father called him to his office, his face stern, his eyes cold. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. "David," his father began, his voice sharp, "I've heard rumors that you've been keeping company with a woman outside of our faith, a Quaker." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he met his father's gaze without wavering. "It's not a rumor, Father," he said calmly. "Her name is Priscilla Ann Wilkinson, and I love her." The room seemed to freeze. Abraham's expression darkened. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. "Love?" he spat, his voice rising with anger. "Love has nothing to do with this, David. This is betrayal. You're turning your back on your family, on our people." David's throat tightened. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing his father's words, the weight of it all, was almost too much to bear. Almost. "I'm not betraying anyone," David replied, his voice steady, though inside his heart was breaking. "I'm following my own path." Abraham stood abruptly, slamming his hands down on the desk. "Your own path?" he thundered. "What path is that? A path that leads away from everything we've built? A path that abandons your faith, your family, your future?" David felt the sting of his father's words, but his resolve didn't falter. He had made his choice. "I love her," he said again, softer this time, but no less certain. "And I will marry her, with or without your blessing." The silence that followed was unbearable. David's mother, standing quietly in the corner, finally spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "David, think of what you're doing," she pleaded. "Your father, your brothers, we've given you everything. Don't throw it all away for love." But David's mind was made up. "I am thinking, Mother," he said, his voice filled with the weight of his decision. "I've thought long and hard about this. Priscilla is the woman I want to spend my life with, and nothing will change that." And with that, the room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tight. His father turned away, unable to look at his son. "Then you're no longer a part of this family," Abraham said, his voice cold, final. "You've made your choice. Now live with it." David walked out of his father's office, the world spinning around him. He had always known this moment would be painful, but the reality was like a knife to the heart. His family, had disowned him. He was alone, cast out. Everything he had known, everything that had shaped him, had crumbled in a single moment. And yet, somewhere deep inside him, there was a flicker of something else. Freedom. He could hear the wind howling outside, as if the city itself knew the weight of what had just happened. The London streets were dark, cold, but David walked through them with a purpose. Priscilla was waiting for him. She was the reason he had made this choice, the reason he had risked everything. And as he approached her house, his heart swelled with a mixture of fear and hope. "David?" Priscilla opened the door, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened? What did your father say?" He didn't have to answer. The look on his face said it all. "They've disowned me," David said quietly, the words heavy with the finality of it. "I'm no longer welcome in their home. I've lost everything." But Priscilla, with tears in her eyes, took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You haven't lost everything," she whispered. "You still have me." In that moment, David felt something shift inside him. The pain of his family's rejection was still there, but it was joined by something else, determination. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. He had Priscilla by his side, and together they would face whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. David's family ties had been severed, and with them the safety net of wealth and comfort. He had been raised in privilege, trained to succeed in his father's business, but now he had to build his life from scratch. The doors of opportunity had closed, but David Ricardo was not a man to give up. He had never been. This was the turning point. His mind, restless and brilliant, could no longer be confined to the narrow world of stockbroking. He had always felt it, an ambition greater than himself, a need to understand the deeper forces at work in the world. And now, he was free to pursue that ambition without looking back. Priscilla's love gave him strength, but it was David's own drive that pushed him forward. He threw himself into his studies, devouring books on economics, trade, and politics. He was determined to prove that his choice, to follow his heart, to defy his family, wasn't a mistake. And slowly, piece by piece, the foundations of his future began to take shape. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. He was starting from nothing, rebuilding his life from the ground up. But David Ricardo was no longer bound by the expectations of others. He was free. Free to think, free to love, and free to change the world in ways no one could have imagined. And so, the stage was set. The young man who had defied his family, who had been cast out for love, was about to embark on a path that would lead him to greatness, a path that would reshape the world of economics forever. Chapter 4. Self-Made Man. A New Path Emerges. David Ricardo walked through the crowded streets of London, his heart heavy, yet his mind clear. Banished from his family's wealth, cut off from the comfortable life he had always known, he was now a man alone. The doors of his father's grand home were closed to him forever. The world of privilege, of certainty, was gone. All he had left was his determination. But David, penniless as he now was, stood tall. He wasn't broken. No, not at all. There was something deep within him, a fire that wouldn't go out. The world may have stripped him of his family's fortune, but it couldn't take his greatest asset, his mind. And so, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge in his head, he stepped into the London Stock Exchange, unchanged, unshaken. The Stock Exchange was a world unto itself. The air crackled with energy, with the rise and fall of fortunes, the endless rhythm of buying and selling, shouting and bartering. The men here had power, real power, power to control the flow of money, of goods, of wealth across nations. Ricardo had grown up in this world, had seen it from the inside, and now he was ready to carve out his own place within it. But it wouldn't be easy. Without the backing of his family, without the connections and reputation of his father, he was just another man in the crowd, just another name. But there was something different about David, and it didn't take long for others to notice. On his first day, Ricardo stood at the edge of the exchange, watching, listening. His sharp eyes followed the movements of the traders, his mind calculating, analyzing every deal, every shift in price. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He understood the flow of the market, the invisible forces behind the numbers, and soon he began to make his moves. At first, he took small risks, placing modest bets, barely noticeable. But they paid off. Each win, each successful trade, fueled him. His reputation started to grow, whispered among the traders. "Who is this young man? How does he understand the market so well?" And it wasn't just his success that drew attention. It was his calm. Even in the heat of a deal, when others rushed, when they panicked, Ricardo remained steady. His talent for numbers, his ability to predict shifts in the market, it was uncanny. He could see the future in a way no one else could. As the days turned into weeks, David's wealth began to grow again, slowly but surely. Every trade brought him closer to rebuilding his life, to proving that he didn't need his family's fortune to succeed. But something else was stirring within him, something deeper than the thrill of the market. Each night, after the hustle of the exchange had quieted, Ricardo would return home, tired but restless. He would sit with a candle, his mind racing with thoughts, thoughts not of profits, but of principles. His love for economics had never left him, and now it called to him louder than ever. The market was a game, yes, but David knew there was more to it than just winning and losing. There were rules, forces, laws that governed it all, laws that he was determined to uncover. He began reading voraciously, devouring books on trade, taxation, and economics. He wasn't content with just playing the game. He wanted to understand it. The works of Adam Smith had lit the spark, but now Ricardo was ready to go further. He wanted to challenge the way people thought about wealth, about nations, about the very fabric of the economy itself. And so, between his days at the stock exchange and his nights spent studying, David Ricardo's mind began to shift. He was no longer just a trader, no longer just a man rebuilding his fortune. He was becoming a thinker, an economist, a man with ideas that would one day change the world. But still, the road ahead was long. The more he studied, the more he realized how complex the economy truly was. It wasn't just about goods and services, about supply and demand. It was about people, about nations, about the choices that shaped the destinies of entire populations, and more importantly, it was about how nations could grow richer together, not at each other's expense, but through cooperation. It was during one of these late nights that David stumbled upon an idea that would forever change his course. He sat at his desk, surrounded by books and papers, his candle burning low, when it hit him: comparative advantage. The theory, still forming in his mind, was simple yet revolutionary. It wasn't about who was best at producing something, but who was relatively better. Trade, Ricardo realized, wasn't about competition. It was about collaboration. Even if one nation was more efficient at producing everything, it could still benefit from trading with others. It was the difference in opportunity costs that mattered. His pulse quickened as he scribbled down notes, his heart racing with excitement. This was the key to unlocking the mystery of trade. But the world wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. David's success at the stock exchange continued to grow, but in his heart, he knew there was something bigger waiting for him. He was no longer just a man looking to rebuild his fortune. No, he was a man on the verge of something much greater. Each day, as he made his trades, as he watched the market ebb and flow, he couldn't help but think about the ideas forming in his mind, the principles that could reshape the way people understood wealth. And yet, even with all his success, there was a sense of loneliness, of being an outsider in the world he inhabited. The other traders saw him as a brilliant mind, yes, but they couldn't see the storm brewing inside him. They didn't know about the restless nights, the hours spent poring over economic theories. They didn't know that Ricardo's mind was no longer just on the numbers in front of him, but on the future of economic thought itself. David Ricardo, the man who had once been cast out by his family, was now rising higher than he had ever imagined. But his path, his true path, had only just begun. The world of economics was calling to him louder than ever, and soon, very soon, he would answer that call. His journey as a self-made man was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Chapter 5. A Curious Encounter, Adam Smith's Legacy. It began as just another day, a day like any other. The streets of London were bustling, filled with the familiar sounds of horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones, merchants shouting their prices, and the never-ending hum of commerce. David Ricardo, now a rising figure in the world of trade, walked through those streets, his mind already filled with numbers, deals, and the shifting tides of the market. But today, something was about to change. Something unexpected. Ricardo had never been one for distractions. His days were spent on the stock exchange, his evenings with books and ledgers, his mind constantly calculating, constantly searching for the deeper meaning behind the chaos of trade. But as he passed a small dusty bookshop, something caught his eye. There in the window was a book, a thick volume worn with age, its title barely visible beneath the layers of dust. Curiosity tugged at him. He paused just for a moment. His heart quickened. He had heard whispers of this book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Traders spoke of it in hushed tones. Economists revered it. Ricardo, always the practical man, had ignored it for too long. But today was different. With a deep breath, he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The smell of old leather and parchment filled the air, the light dim and warm. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper barely looked up from his newspaper as David approached the shelf, his fingers brushing the spine of the book that would change his life. He picked it up, the weight of it heavy in his hands. The Wealth of Nations. His eyes scanned the cover, and something stirred inside him. Something more than curiosity. This could be the answer he had been searching for. This could explain the questions that had plagued him for so long. Without hesitation, he purchased the book and hurried home, his mind already racing with anticipation. That night, by the dim glow of a flickering candle, David opened the first page. His fingers trembled slightly as he began to read. Adam Smith's words. They were unlike anything he had ever encountered. The ideas within the Wealth of Nations flowed like a river, each thought building upon the last, sweeping Ricardo away into a world of economics, trade, and human behavior. He read late into the night, his eyes devouring the pages, his mind soaring. Smith spoke of the invisible hand, the unseen force that guided markets, the natural order that emerged when individuals pursued their own self-interest. The markets weren't just random. There were rules, principles that governed them, and Smith had laid them out with stunning clarity. Ricardo's heart raced as he read, his thoughts spinning, ideas swirling in his head like a storm. Could it be that the chaos of the stock exchange, the unpredictability of trade, the rise and fall of fortunes, could all of it be explained by these simple, elegant principles? The night passed in a blur. Hours slipped by, unnoticed. He was completely absorbed, lost in the world of Adam Smith's ideas. The candle burned low, but Ricardo's mind burned brighter than ever before. He felt as though a door had opened, a door to a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped not just the markets, but the world itself. Smith wrote of division of labor, how specialization made economies more efficient, how each person, by focusing on one task, contributed to the greater wealth of society. Ricardo's eyes widened with excitement. He had seen it, of course, on the exchange, in the factories, in the ports. But now, with Smith's words as a guide, it all began to make sense. He read on, devouring every chapter, every line, every idea. But as the dawn light crept through the window, a new question emerged in Ricardo's mind. Could there be more? The thought gnawed at him, even as the brilliance of Smith's ideas dazzled him. Smith had laid out the foundation. Yes, that much was clear. But was it possible that there was something beyond these principles? Something that Smith had missed? Ricardo's mind, always restless, always searching, couldn't help but wonder. He closed the book, his hands still trembling slightly. The wealth of nations had sparked a revolution in his thinking, but it wasn't enough. He needed to go further. There were still gaps to be filled, mysteries to be solved. Smith had shown him the way, but now it was up to Ricardo to take the next step. In the days that followed, Ricardo's mind was consumed by this new vision. He couldn't stop thinking about Smith's theories, couldn't stop applying them to everything he saw around him. The flow of goods, the rise of prices, the movement of markets, it all began to fall into place, as if Smith's ideas were the key that unlocked the hidden structure of the world. But even as he marveled at this new understanding, Ricardo felt the pull of something deeper. He began to question. He began to challenge. Could Smith's ideas explain everything? Was there a force even greater than the invisible hand, something that could offer even more insight into the complexities of trade and economics? He returned to his books with renewed purpose, diving deeper into the world of economics, pushing himself to understand not just what Smith had written, but what he could contribute. He began to explore new concepts, new theories, daring to think beyond the boundaries that had been set. One night, as Ricardo sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, he felt it, a spark of inspiration, comparative advantage, the idea that nations, even if they were less efficient in producing everything, could still benefit from trade by focusing on what they could do relatively better. His pulse quickened. This was the answer he had been searching for, a new layer to Smith's theories, a new way of understanding the power of trade. Ricardo scribbled down notes furiously, his heart pounding with excitement. He could see it now, clear as day. Nations didn't have to compete in everything to thrive. They could specialize, they could trade, and both would benefit. It wasn't about who was best. It was about who had the advantage. David Ricardo's world had changed forever. Adam Smith's words had set him on a new path, but now Ricardo was forging his own way. The questions that had once haunted him, the mysteries of wealth, trade, and nations, were no longer unsolvable puzzles. He was beginning to understand the answers, and with each passing day, his ideas grew stronger, bolder, more revolutionary. His journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. But one thing was certain. David Ricardo would not rest until he had unraveled the deepest truths of economics. He was no longer just a man of trade, he was a man of ideas, and the world was about to take notice. Chapter 6. The First Insight, Labor and Value. The night was quiet, still. Only the faint crackling of a fire in the hearth and the flickering light of a single candle filled the room. Outside, London slept. But inside, David Ricardo was wide awake. At his desk, papers were scattered everywhere, books peeled high, ink stains smutting the edges. Ricardo, his brow furrowed, scribbled furiously, his quill scratching against the parchment as if it were a race against time. His mind was ablaze. An idea had taken root, and he could feel it growing, expanding, demanding to be brought to life. Labor. Value. The words echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing moment. Could it be? Could the value of goods, the prices that govern the markets, all be tied to one thing, to labor? His pulse quickened as he scrawled more notes, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this the key? Was this the answer he had been searching for all along? It had started as just a thought, a fleeting question that had passed through his mind one evening as he observed the markets. He had seen prices rise and fall, goods being bought and sold, fortunes won and lost. But why? What was it that truly determined the value of something? Why was one thing worth more than another? He had always assumed, like many, that it was simply supply and demand, the whims of the market. But something about that answer, it didn't sit right with him. It wasn't enough. There had to be more to it. There had to be a deeper truth. And then it hit him. Labor, the time, the effort, the work that went into producing something. Could that be it? Could that be the invisible force that determined value? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. A good wasn't valuable simply because people wanted it. It was valuable because of the labor that had gone into making it, the human effort that had brought it into existence. Ricardo's heart raced. His quill moved faster, his hand barely able to keep up with the flood of ideas pouring from his mind. Every product, every commodity, every good, all of them, required labor. And the more labor something took, the more valuable it was. The pieces were falling into place. He could feel it. But then, doubt crept in. Ricardo paused, the quill hovering above the paper. Could it really be so simple? Could the value of goods be reduced to nothing more than the labor required to produce them? His mind raced with questions, with uncertainties. What about rare goods? What about land or natural resources? Was labor really the only factor? His thoughts tumbled over one another as he considered the complexity of the market, the countless variables at play. But still, his intuition told him there was truth in this idea. Labor, he realized, wasn't the only factor, but it was the primary one. It was the foundation upon which value was built. Without labor, there would be nothing. No goods, no products, no wealth. Ricardo's hand resumed its furious writing. His notes filled page after page as he worked through the implications of his discovery. If labor determined value, then what did that mean for the way economies functioned? What did it mean for the way wealth was distributed, for the relationship between workers and owners, between nations? Hours passed. The candle flickered, its flame dancing in the darkness, casting long shadows across the room. Ricardo, lost in thought, barely noticed. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest as the enormity of his discovery began to sink in. This could change everything. If labor was the source of value, then economics wasn't just about numbers and markets. It was about people. It was about the workers who toiled in the factories, the farmers who tilled the land, the craftsmen who shaped raw materials into goods. Their labor wasn't just a cost of production, it was the very thing that gave those goods value. His hands trembled as he wrote. This was more than a theory. This was a revelation. Ricardo could see it now, clear as day. The world of economics, the world of wealth and trade, wasn't just about capital or resources, it was about labor. But then, the doubt returned. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the pages of notes before him. Would anyone listen? Would anyone care? The world of economics was dominated by established theories, by men who believed in the power of markets, of supply and demand. They weren't interested in the deeper truths that Ricardo had uncovered. Would they even understand? He could already hear the voices of critics in his head, dismissing his ideas as too simplistic, too radical. Value is subjective, they would say. People buy goods because they want them, not because of the labor behind them. But Ricardo knew. He knew there was more to it than that. The market was not just a reflection of desire. It was a reflection of labor. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear. He had stumbled upon something revolutionary, something that could reshape the way people thought about economics. But the question remained, would anyone listen? Ricardo stood, pacing the room, his mind still racing with ideas. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just keep this discovery to himself. He had to share it with the world, even if that world wasn't ready to hear it. He had to write, to publish, to challenge the accepted wisdom of the day. The markets would rise and fall, fortunes would be won and lost, but Ricardo's ideas, his ideas, could last forever. This was more than just a theory about value. It was a theory about the way the world worked, about the forces that shaped society, about the truth behind the wealth of nations. And so, with renewed determination, Ricardo returned to his desk, his quill poised once more over the paper. He would write, he would refine his ideas, challenge them, test them, and then, when the time was right, he would release them into the world. The candle flickered again, its flame growing dimmer, but Ricardo's mind burned brighter than ever. The discovery of labor's role in determining value was just the beginning. There were more insights to come, more ideas to explore. His journey had only just begun, and the world of economics would never be the same. Would anyone listen? Perhaps not at first, but they would. Eventually, they would. Chapter 7. A world in conflict, war and opportunity. Europe was in turmoil. The drums of war thundered across the continent as Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions swept through nations like wildfire. Borders shifted, alliances broke, armies marched, and everywhere there was chaos. But in that chaos, for some, there was also opportunity. David Ricardo, now a successful investor, watched as the Napoleonic Wars shook the foundations of Europe. Countries were plunged into uncertainty, economies strained under the weight of war. Prices soared, grain, metals, textiles, everything became more expensive. The world seemed on the edge of collapse, and yet, Ricardo saw possibility. In the markets, while others panicked, David remained calm, calculating, observant. He knew how to read the signs, how to follow the movements of goods, how to anticipate the impact of war on trade. The war may have been tearing Europe apart, but for Ricardo, it was also creating opportunities to invest. And invest he did. As nations struggled, demand for resources grew and prices skyrocketed. Ricardo's investments began to soar. His wealth multiplied at a staggering pace. While the world around him descended into uncertainty, he thrived. But as the money piled up, something else stirred within him. His drive, his passion for understanding economics grew stronger, louder. It was no longer about making money. It wasn't about stocks or bonds, not anymore. Ricardo's mind had latched onto something far more profound. How do nations work? How does war reshape the flow of wealth? How does an economy survive, even thrive, when the world is burning around it? One cold morning, as he sat in his office, watching the latest reports come in from across Europe, Ricardo's thoughts drifted beyond the immediate gains. Yes, he had made money. But why? What was it that allowed him to prosper while others suffered? He studied the reports, looking at the movements of goods, the rise in grain prices, the effects of blockades and trade disruptions. His mind raced with questions. What drove these prices? What forces, invisible yet undeniable, controlled the flow of wealth in times of war. Ricardo realized it wasn't just about supply and demand. There was something deeper, something structural, shaping the way nations traded, the way they interacted in times of peace and in times of conflict. Could war itself be a force that changed the rules of economics? As the war raged on, Ricardo's wealth continued to grow. His investments were strategic, timely. He had an instinct for the markets that few could match. But as the money poured in, Ricardo found himself strangely unsatisfied. The figures in his bank account no longer gave him the thrill they once did. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by larger questions. What made one nation rich and another poor? How did war shift the balance of power between countries? And more importantly, could there be a way to understand these forces, to predict them, even in the chaos of conflict? One evening, as he sat in his study, surrounded by papers, maps, and reports from the war front, an idea began to take shape. He realized that nations weren't just isolated entities trading goods. They were deeply interconnected. And war, far from destroying those connections, often intensified them. Even when borders were drawn in blood, the economy continued to pulse, to move, to adapt. Ricardo's mind raced. He could see it now, how the war had created new opportunities for trade, how nations, in their desperation, had found ways to keep the flow of goods moving. Smugglers, secret deals, underground markets. The war had opened new channels, new paths for wealth to travel. And Ricardo, he was right there, following the money, understanding the game. But it wasn't enough. He needed to go further. He needed to dive deeper into the heart of these economic forces. His thoughts turned once again to his theory of comparative advantage, the idea that nations could benefit from trade even when one was more efficient than the other. But now, he wondered, could this theory apply in times of war as well? Could it explain the way nations continued to grow rich even while battling for survival? The question consumed him. He spent days, nights, weeks studying the patterns, the movements of wealth between countries at war. He corresponded with traders, with fellow economists, searching for answers, for clues that could explain what he was seeing. And slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. War, Ricardo realized, didn't just disrupt economies, it transformed them. It revealed the underlying strengths and weaknesses of nations. It exposed how wealth moved, not just through peace, but through conflict. And it was all tied back to labor, to value, to the principles he had been developing all along. His heart raced as he connected the dots. War was not just a force of destruction. It was also a force of economic evolution. Nations that understood how to trade, how to harness their comparative advantage, could thrive even in the most difficult of times. And those that didn't, they were doomed to fall. Ricardo scribbled furiously, his quill dancing across the paper as his thoughts crystallized into new insights, new theories. He was no longer just an investor, no longer just a man growing rich from the chaos of war. He was a thinker, an economist on the verge of uncovering something that could change the world. But with each new revelation came a question. Would the world listen? Ricardo's theories were complex, challenging the conventional wisdom of the time. Nations, especially those at war, were focused on survival, not on economic theories. Would they care? Would they understand what he was trying to say? Ricardo shook off the doubt. He had come too far to turn back now. The wealth he had gained from the war was only the beginning. His mind was set on something far greater: understanding. He wasn't just a participant in the game of economics anymore. He was rewriting the rules. The Napoleonic Wars had reshaped Europe, but they had also reshaped Ricardo's mind. He now saw the world through a different lens, a lens of interconnectedness, of opportunity even in chaos. Nations, he realized, were like traders in a vast, complex market, each one seeking to maximize their own advantage. And he was the one who would explain how it all worked. And so, with the war still raging around him, Ricardo's journey continued. His wealth grew, but more importantly, so did his understanding. He had unlocked something powerful, something that went beyond profit and loss, beyond the rise and fall of prices. He had seen how nations, even in their darkest moments, could find ways to thrive, and he would make sure the world understood it too. David Ricardo wasn't just a man of the markets anymore. He was becoming a man of ideas, a man whose theories would one day change the way the world understood wealth, trade, and nations. The war had opened the door, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 8. The Great Debate: Ricardo Meets Malthus. The room was still, but the air electric. Two men stood across from each other, their eyes locked, their minds sharpened like blades. David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, two of the greatest economic thinkers of their time. Friends. Yes, but rivals too. And today, that rivalry would come to a head. The debate had been brewing for months, maybe even years. Their correspondence had begun with polite exchanges, but as their ideas evolved, so did the tension between them. They disagreed on so much: population, resources, the very future of society itself. And now, face to face, there would be no letters to soften the blow, no distance to dull the impact of their words. Malthus, a tall and stern figure, was first to speak. His voice, deep and calm, filled the room. "David," he began, his tone measured but filled with certainty, "you must see that the unchecked growth of population will lead to disaster. The earth has limits, limits to how much food it can produce, limits to how many people it can support. We cannot escape the reality of scarcity." He paused, watching Ricardo, waiting for a reaction. "Without control," Malthus continued, "we will face famine, poverty, and suffering. The poor will multiply, but the land cannot keep up. Resources will dwindle. We must act, or nature will act for us." Ricardo listened, his face calm, but his heart racing. Malthus was passionate, there was no denying that, and his theory, the so-called Malthusian trap, had captured the imagination of many. The idea that population would outstrip food supply, leading to inevitable collapse, was a grim vision of the future. But Ricardo wasn't convinced. When Ricardo spoke, his voice was clear, steady, but filled with quiet intensity. "Thomas," he said, "I understand your concerns about population, but you're missing something vital. The market, the economy, is not a static thing. It grows. It adapts." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Malthus. "Trade," he continued, "allows nations to exchange what they need, to specialize, to grow beyond the limits of their own resources. It's not just about land and food. It's about innovation, about the power of human ingenuity. The market, Thomas, can solve these problems." Malthus frowned, his jaw tightening. "You're too optimistic, David. You put too much faith in the market. It cannot create more land, more food, more resources. At some point, the system will break. The poor will suffer first, as they always do. You can't rely on trade to fix what nature will inevitably destroy. Ricardo's pulse quickened. The debate was only just beginning. The room felt smaller now, as if the weight of their words was pressing in from all sides. Their ideas clashed like swords, each one striking at the other's core beliefs. Ricardo, ever the defender of markets, believed in the power of trade, in the ability of human beings to find solutions through commerce and exchange. Malthus, on the other hand, saw a world bound by natural limits, a world where population would always outpace food production, leading to inevitable catastrophe. The debate became more heated. "The power of markets?" Malthus scoffed, his voice rising. "And what of the poor, David? What happens to them when food prices rise, when the rich grow wealthier and the masses starve? Your markets can't save them. Your theories are cold, heartless." Ricardo's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Thomas, I care as much about the poor as you do," he said firmly, his voice now tinged with frustration. "But I believe in solutions that go beyond just limiting population growth. Innovation, free trade, these are the keys to prosperity. You talk about scarcity as if it's inevitable, but look at the advancements we've already made. Machinery, agriculture, new methods of production are emerging every day. We can feed more people, produce more goods, if we embrace the power of the market." The intensity in the room was palpable. Neither man would back down. Malthus's face was set in a grim expression as he leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You put too much faith in human progress, David. Nature doesn't care about our innovations. At the end of the day, people will still need food, and there is only so much the land can provide. What happens when we hit that limit? What happens when the population continues to grow and there's not enough to go around?" Ricardo, feeling the heat rise in his chest, responded quickly. "And what happens if we stop innovating, Thomas? What happens if we don't trust in the ingenuity of mankind? You see limits. I see possibilities. You see famine. I see trade opening up new worlds, new opportunities." Malthus shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face. "Possibilities? Trade? You think that nations can just trade their way out of scarcity? Not every country has the luxury of abundant resources, David. Not every nation can rely on trade to solve its problems." Ricardo's eyes flashed with determination. "No, but every nation can benefit from comparative advantage. Nations don't need to be rich in everything. They just need to specialize in what they do best. That's the beauty of trade, Thomas. It allows nations to cooperate, to lift each other up, even in times of scarcity." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension hanging thick between them. They were both right, in their own way. Malthus's fears of overpopulation and scarcity were grounded in real concerns, while Ricardo's belief in the power of trade and innovation offered a more hopeful vision for the future. But this wasn't just an intellectual battle. It was personal. Both men were fighting for their vision of the world, one filled with limits, the other with possibilities, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Malthus, with his head slightly bowed, broke the silence. "David, I don't doubt your intelligence, I don't doubt your passion, but we must prepare for the worst. If we don't take control of population growth, if we don't acknowledge the limits of the Earth's resources, we will face disaster." Ricardo, his voice softer now but no less firm, replied, "And I don't doubt the seriousness of your concerns, Thomas, but I believe in progress. I believe in the ability of humanity to solve even the most difficult problems. The future is uncertain, yes, but I would rather face it with hope than with fear. The debate, intense and passionate, had no clear victor. Ricardo stood by his belief in markets, in the power of trade and innovation to overcome scarcity. Malthus, ever the cautious realist, continued to warn of nature's limits and the dangers of unchecked population growth. Their friendship would survive this clash, but their ideas would continue to battle in the minds of economists for centuries to come. As they parted ways that evening, both men knew that their arguments were far from over. The world was changing, and so too were the challenges it faced. But one thing was certain. Ricardo and Malthus had each made their mark on the future of economics, and the ideas born in this great debate would shape the way nations thought about wealth, resources, and human progress for generations. Chapter 9. A Theory Unveiled. The Power of Comparative Advantage. The moment had arrived. After years of study, debate, and relentless questioning, David Ricardo was on the verge of revealing the idea that would forever change economics. His mind had wrestled with complex questions of trade, wealth, and production, and now it all came together in a single, stunning insight. The concept was simple, yet revolutionary. It wasn't about which nation was best at producing everything. No. It was about who could do things relatively better. A new theory had been born: comparative advantage. Ricardo paced the floor of his study, his hands clasped behind his back, his heart pounding with excitement. He had spent countless hours thinking about trade, about why nations interacted the way they did. Why did countries produce some goods but import others? Why didn't every country just produce what it was best at? Then, it hit him like a bolt of lightning. It's not about absolute efficiency. It's about relative efficiency. Even if one country could produce everything better, that didn't mean it should. In fact, if nations specialized in what they did relatively better and traded with one another, everyone would benefit. Trade wasn't a zero-sum game. It was a way for nations to grow richer together, to lift each other up through cooperation, not competition. That night, by the dim glow of a flickering candle, Ricardo put pen to paper. His heart raced as the words flowed, his ideas becoming clearer with every stroke of the quill. The principle of comparative advantage, a theory that explained why trade worked, why it was so much more powerful than anyone had ever realized. Imagine two nations, he wrote, one that is better at producing both wine and cloth. But even if this nation is more efficient, it should focus on what it produces best, and let the other country focus on what it produces relatively better. By trading, both nations will benefit. He paused for a moment, his pulse quickening. The clarity of the idea was breathtaking. It was simple, yes, but its implications were profound. This was more than just a theory of trade. It was a vision of how nations could prosper through cooperation, how economies could thrive not by isolating themselves, but by working together. Ricardo's quill scratched against the paper as he continued. The power of comparative advantage lies not in who can do things best, but in who can do things relatively better. By focusing on their strengths, nations can trade with one another in ways that benefit everyone. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Ricardo shared his new theory with his fellow economists, his friends, his rivals, and the reaction was staggering. At first there was confusion. How could it be? How could nations benefit from trading if one was clearly more efficient at everything? But as they studied his work, as they grasped the simplicity of his argument, a wave of realization spread across Europe. It wasn't about who was best, it was about specialization. By focusing on what they did relatively better, even the less efficient nations could grow richer. Economists, traders, policymakers, they were stunned. Ricardo had done it. He had unlocked a new way of thinking about trade, about wealth, about the future of nations. Ricardo's theory spread quickly. Economists marveled at its elegance, at its ability to explain the complexities of trade with such clarity. Nations didn't have to compete in everything. They could specialize, they could cooperate, and by doing so, they would all grow richer together. One letter after another arrived at Ricardo's doorstep. Praise from fellow scholars, questions from leaders of industry, requests for explanations from curious traders. The world was buzzing with excitement as Ricardo's theory sent shockwaves through the halls of power and knowledge. In the coffee houses of London, intellectuals debated the implications. In the offices of policymakers, trade agreements were re-examined, recalculated, and in the minds of economists, new possibilities began to emerge. But as the excitement grew, so too did the questions. Could Ricardo's theory hold up in the real world? Could nations truly grow richer by specializing in trading, even when one was more efficient at everything? Ricardo knew that this would be the true test of his idea. Theory was one thing, but practice was another. He continued to refine his work, diving deeper into the mathematics behind his theory, applying it to real-world examples. He knew that his idea wasn't just a breakthrough in economic thinking, it was a solution. It was a way for nations to grow, to prosper, to escape the traps of poverty and isolation, and he was determined to prove it. The turning point came when his theory reached the political stage. Governments across Europe began to take notice. With the Napoleonic Wars behind them, nations were eager to rebuild, to grow their economies once again. And here was Ricardo, offering them a path forward, a way to navigate the complexities of international trade with confidence. One by one, leaders began to adopt his ideas. They saw the potential in comparative advantage, in the power of specialization. Trade agreements were signed, alliances formed, and slowly but surely, Ricardo's vision began to take shape in the real world. The world had changed, and Ricardo had helped shape that change. Years later, looking back on this moment, Ricardo would realize just how monumental his discovery had been. Comparative advantage wasn't just an economic theory, it was a framework for understanding the world. A way for nations to connect, to cooperate, to grow together. His heart swelled with pride, but not just for the success of his idea. It was for the promise of what it could bring, a future where nations worked together, where trade wasn't a source of conflict, but of prosperity. He had seen it, clear as day, the power of comparative advantage, the power of cooperation. Chapter 10. The Written Legacy, Principles of Political Economy. The room was quiet, except for the soft scratch of a quill on paper. David Ricardo sat at his desk, his hand trembling slightly as he dipped the quill into ink, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to write. Before him lay the beginnings of his magnum opus, the work that would define his legacy, the principles of political economy and taxation. Every line, every word, captured the essence of his life's work, his discoveries, his theories, his passion for economics. He had poured his soul into this book, determined to leave behind a blueprint for future generations, a guide to understanding the forces that governed wealth, trade, and society. But as he wrote, something else lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow that he couldn't ignore. His health. It was slipping away. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath, his chest tightening with each inhale. He could feel it. Time was running out, but he couldn't stop. Not now. There was too much at stake, too much he needed to share before it was too late. His body may have been weakening, but his mind was still sharp, still full of fire. And that fire drove him forward, even as the whispers of decline grew louder. With a sigh, he bent over the paper once more, his quill gliding across the page, each stroke deliberate, precise. In this book, Ricardo explained everything: rent, wages, trade, the distribution of wealth. He had spent years studying these subjects, debating them, refining his ideas. Now, at last, he was putting it all down for the world to see. He wrote of rent, how landowners, simply by owning land, could extract wealth from society. He explained the rise of rents as demand for land grew, pushing the cost higher and higher. He wrote of wages, how the price of labor was determined by the supply of workers and the demand for their skills. And he wrote of trade, the very foundation of his comparative advantage theory, showing how nations could grow richer by specializing and exchanging goods. But with every stroke of the quill, Ricardo felt a growing urgency. His hand trembled as he wrote, his breath shallow. He could hear the whispers, his family, his friends worried about his health, concerned that he was pushing himself too hard. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. He had to finish this work. He had to leave something behind that would last, something that would outlive him. He pushed through the pain, his focus never wavering. The words flowed from him like a torrent, each one building on the last. He explained the concept of diminishing returns, how as more labor and capital were applied to land, the yield would eventually decrease. He explored the relationship between profits and wages, showing how they were linked, how the rise of one could mean the fall of the other. It was all connected: land, labor, capital, trade. The entire economy was a web of relationships, and Ricardo, with this book, was pulling back the curtain, revealing the intricate workings of the system for all to see. But as the days passed, Ricardo's health continued to decline. He could feel it in his bones, the fatigue weighing on him like an anchor. His once strong hands, now shaking, struggled to keep pace with the thoughts racing through his mind. There was so much left to say, so much more to explain. He couldn't stop now. Not yet. The world outside his study seemed far away, distant, as if time itself had slowed. The only thing that mattered now was the book in front of him. He was creating something that would last, something that would endure long after he was gone. And still, the whispers grew louder. He could hear them in the halls of his home, quiet conversations between his loved ones, voices filled with worry. "He's working too hard," they said. "He needs rest." But Ricardo ignored them. He couldn't afford to rest, not with so much left to do. As the final pages of his manuscript began to take shape, Ricardo's mind turned to the future. He knew that this book, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, would stir debate, would challenge the thinkers of his time. His ideas about rent, wages, trade, they were controversial, radical even. but he believed in them with every fiber of his being. Would the world listen? Would anyone care? He couldn't be sure. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had put it all down, that he had given the world something to think about, to build upon. He thought of his debates with Malthus, of their passionate discussions about population, scarcity, and the future of society. This book would stand as his answer to those debates, his contribution to the great questions of their time. Where Malthus saw limits, Ricardo saw possibilities, and with this book, he hoped to show the world what he had seen. At last, the final line was written. Ricardo set down his quill, his hand shaking, his breath unsteady. He looked at the pages before him, the culmination of years of work, of thought, of passion, the principles of political economy and taxation, his legacy. But even as he stared at the manuscript, a pang of doubt crept into his mind. Would this be enough? Had he done all he could? Had he truly captured everything he wanted to say? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. He had given everything he had to this work. Every ounce of strength, every last bit of energy had gone into these pages. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The whispers were no longer distant. They were all around him now, growing louder with every passing day. His health was failing. Time was slipping away. But as he closed his eyes, a sense of peace washed over him. He had done it. He had created something that would live on, something that would inspire future generations, that would shape the way the world understood economics. His work was complete. The whispers continued. But Ricardo... He was no longer listening. His masterpiece was finished, and with it, his legacy was secure. The world would change because of what he had written, and that, for him, was enough. The name David Ricardo would echo through the halls of history, not as a wealthy man, not as a trader, but as a thinker, as the man who had unlocked the mysteries of political economy. Chapter 11. The Final Debate. Ricardo's Last Days. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow through the windows of David Ricardo's study. He sat in his chair, looking out at the world he had helped shape. The papers on his desk were still, the ink dry. His masterpiece, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, had been written, published, finished. And yet, as his body weakened, as the days slipped away, one final question loomed large in his mind. Had he done enough? It was a debate, one that played out not with rivals or colleagues, but within himself. His ideas, his theories. They had stirred the minds of economists, challenged the accepted truths of the time. But would they last? Would anyone remember his work once he was gone? Ricardo's breath was shallow now, his once strong body growing frail, but his mind remained sharp, alive, filled with the same restless energy that had driven him throughout his life. He thought of the long nights spent studying, writing, debating, the conversations with his friends, his family, and with his great rival, Thomas Malthus. Malthus. Even now, in his final days, Ricardo could almost hear the man's voice. Their debates had been fierce, passionate, each one pushing the other to defend their ideas, to refine their arguments. Ricardo had never agreed with Malthus's grim view of the future, his belief that population growth would inevitably lead to famine, to poverty. No. Ricardo had always believed in the power of human ingenuity, in the ability of markets and trade to lift nations out of scarcity. And yet, as he sat there, his hands trembling, he couldn't help but wonder. Was Malthus right? Had he been too optimistic? Had he put too much faith in the power of markets, of trade? The world was changing. New challenges lay ahead. Would his ideas stand the test of time? The debate raged inside him, each thought clashing with the next. He had spent his life building a theory, crafting a vision of how economies worked, how nations could grow richer together through cooperation. Comparative advantage, the cornerstone of his legacy. But was it enough? Ricardo's thoughts turned to his family, his wife Priscilla, his children. They had stood by him, supported him, even as he poured every ounce of himself into his work. But had he given enough of himself to them? He had spent so much time in his study, so many hours lost in thought, in theory. Had he missed the moments that truly mattered? His heart ached with the weight of these questions. He had been a man of ideas, yes, but had he been a good father, a good husband? The whispers of doubt crept in, threatening to overshadow everything he had accomplished. As the shadows in the room grew longer, Ricardo closed his eyes, his mind wandering back through the years. He saw himself as a young man, filled with ambition, with curiosity. He had defied his family's expectations, married the woman he loved, built a fortune on the stock exchange, and then he had walked away from it all. Not for money, but for ideas. His love of economics, of understanding the world, had driven him to pursue something greater than himself. And now, as his journey neared its end, he wondered if the world would remember him for what he had truly been, a man of thought, of vision. Would the future generations understand what he had tried to achieve? Would they see the value in his work, in the principles he had so carefully laid out? The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. Ricardo's thoughts turned to his legacy. He thought of the economists who would come after him, the students who would read his work, who would challenge it, build upon it. He had opened a door, but the journey was far from over. His ideas, his theories, they would live on. But would they evolve? Would the world continue to explore the path he had begun to chart? A faint smile crossed his lips as he thought of the future. He could almost see it. New debates, new discoveries, new minds picking up where he had left off. And in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. He had done enough. His work was complete. But the ideas, the questions, they would never be finished. His thoughts drifted back to Malthus one last time. The two men had been rivals, yes, but they had also been friends. Their debates had shaped both of them, pushing them to think harder, to question more deeply. Ricardo wondered if Malthus had found peace in his own final days. Did he, too, wonder if his work would last? But there was no bitterness in Ricardo's heart now, no sense of unfinished business. He had made his contribution, left his mark on the world. And in the quiet of that room, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that was all he could ask for. The sun had set, the room bathed in twilight. Ricardo's body, weakened by illness, had little strength left, but his mind, ever the explorer, continued to search for answers, to grapple with the questions that had defined his life. And though his journey was ending, he knew his ideas were only just beginning. The principles he had laid down would stand as a foundation for future generations. Economists would debate, dissect, and build upon his work, but the spark he had ignited would never go out. His theories would shape the world for centuries to come, even as new thinkers rose to challenge them. Ricardo's time on this earth was almost over, but his legacy would endure. His journey may have reached its final chapter, but the story of his ideas was only just beginning. And with that thought, Ricardo closed his eyes, a sense of calm washing over him. His work was done, and he was at peace. Chapter 12. The Immortal Idea. Ricardo lives on. And so, the man is gone. David Ricardo, whose brilliant mind once soared with ideas, whose hands once crafted the very theories that would reshape the world, is no longer. His journey has ended. But his ideas, his vision, his genius, they remain. They continue to ripple through time, influencing, shaping, and guiding the course of nations. The name David Ricardo has become more than just a name. It's a legacy. And that legacy begins with one idea, one revolutionary insight that would forever change the way we understand trade, economics, and the wealth of nations. Comparative advantage. The world moves on, but Ricardo's theory remains at its core. Nations trade, economies grow, and leaders across the globe look to Ricardo's work as a guiding light. It was his genius that revealed a simple truth, one that would stand the test of time. Trade is not about who is the best, who produces the most, who can dominate. No, it's about who can do things relatively better. Even as new challenges arise, as global markets evolve, the power of comparative advantage stays steady, unshaken. Ricardo's theory showed the world that even when one country is more efficient at producing everything, trade can still make everyone richer, everyone better off. By specializing in what they do best, nations can cooperate, not compete. And in that cooperation lies prosperity. The impact of this idea is enormous. Look around, from the bustling ports of Shanghai to the vibrant markets of New York City, from the agricultural fields of Brazil to the technology hubs of Japan. Trade flows, goods move, economies rise and fall. And behind it all, quietly guiding the movement of wealth across borders, is Ricardo's immortal insight. Economists, policymakers, and scholars continue to study his work, refining it, building upon it. Comparative advantage is now a cornerstone of modern economics, taught in universities, discussed in the halls of power, shaping trade agreements between nations. But this wasn't always the case. When Ricardo first published his theory, the world was skeptical. The idea seemed almost too simple. Could it really be that everyone benefits from trade? Could nations truly grow richer together? Economists of the time struggled to grasp the full depth of Ricardo's insight. But as the years passed, as nations began to embrace the power of trade, Ricardo's theory proved itself again and again. His vision became reality, and the world took notice. As Europe recovered from the Napoleonic Wars, as industrial revolutions swept through the West, Ricardo's ideas became more important than ever. Countries that had once waged war against each other began to see the potential of working together. Trade opened doors that had once been locked, creating new opportunities, building bridges between nations. And even now, in the modern age, Ricardo's ideas continue to thrive. Think of it, when two countries, vastly different in resources, in culture, in capacity, come together to trade, both benefit. The more efficient nation focuses on what it does best. The other, though less efficient overall, specializes in what it can produce relatively better. They exchange, they grow, they prosper. It is not a competition, but a partnership, one that has shaped the world economy for centuries, and one that will continue to shape it for centuries more. And at the heart of it all, at the very core of this system, is David Ricardo. His name lives on, not just in books or academic journals, but in the daily lives of people across the globe. The products we buy, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, all of it is touched by the invisible hand of Ricardo's ideas. When nations trade, when economies flourish, Ricardo's legacy breathes life into those moments. But his contributions weren't just about trade. No, Ricardo's work went deeper. He examined the roots of wealth, the foundations of economies. His insights into rent, wages, and profits continue to influence the way we understand the distribution of wealth, the relationships between workers, landowners, and capitalists. He revealed the complex dance between land, labor, and capital, showing how each one played a role in the ever-evolving story of economies. And yet, it is his theory of comparative advantage that truly stands out. It's the idea that defines him, that immortalizes him. Nations continue to seek his wisdom, though many do not even know his name. His theory is now woven into the very fabric of modern economics, into the agreements that bind nations together. Ricardo's voice, though silent, echoes in every trade deal, every tariff discussion, every economic policy that reaches across borders. And so, the man may be gone, but his influence is eternal. David Ricardo lives on, not in flesh, but in ideas, in the principles that guide nations toward prosperity. His work, his brilliance, has transcended time. He gave the world a gift, an understanding of how we can grow, not by dividing, but by uniting. Not by competing, but by cooperating. The sun may have set on his life, but the light of his ideas burns bright, illuminating the path forward for all who follow in his footsteps. Economists, scholars, leaders, they all stand on the shoulders of Ricardo. And as the world continues to change, as new challenges arise, his ideas will remain, guiding, inspiring, shaping. David Ricardo's journey may have come to an end, but his story is far from over. And that, dear listener, is how the man who once sat in a quiet study, scribbling by candlelight, came to shape the very world we live in. His name, his vision, his genius live on, eternal. The world will never forget David Ricardo.